What is dopamine, and what are maybe some things about dopamine that most people don't know, and probably that I don't know either?
So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and neurotransmitters are those molecules that bridge the gap between two neurons. So they essentially allow one neuron, the presynaptic neuron, to communicate with the postsynaptic neuron. Dopamine is intimately associated with the experience of reward, but also with movement, which I think is really interesting because movement and reward are linked, right? If you think about early humans, you had to move in order to go seek out the water or the meat or whatever it was. And even in the most primitive organisms, dopamine is released when food is sensed in the environment. For example, C. elegans, a very primitive worm. So dopamine is this really powerful, important molecule in the brain that helps us experience pleasure. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in pleasure, but it's a really, really important one. And if you want to think about something that most people don't know about dopamine, which I think is really interesting, is that we are always releasing dopamine at a kind of tonic baseline rate. And it's really the deviation from that baseline rather than like hits of dopamine in a vacuum that make a difference. So when we experience pleasure, our dopamine release goes above baseline. And likewise, dopamine can go below that tonic baseline. And then we experience a kind of pain.
Interesting. So is it fair to say that one's baseline levels of dopamine, how frequently we are releasing dopamine in the absence of some, drug or food or experience, just sitting, being, is that associated with how happy somebody is, their kind of baseline of happiness or level of depression?
There is evidence that shows that people who are depressed may indeed have lower tonic levels of dopamine. So that's a really reasonable thought. And there's some evidence to suggest that may be true. The other thing that we know, and this is, really kind of what the book is about, is that if we expose ourselves chronically to substances or behaviors that repeatedly release large amounts of dopamine in our brain's reward pathway, that we can change our tonic baseline and actually lower it over time as our brain tries to compensate for all of that dopamine, which is more really than we were designed to experience.
Need motivation?
Watch a top 10 with Believe Nation.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because you are probably the most ambitious person in your circle, but you know you're capable of more. And you get that push by surrounding yourself with the best. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Anna Lembke, and my take on her top 10 rules for success. Enjoy. Rule number 2, limit screen time.
What we decided to do, my husband and I, was that we ourselves, now this is our eldest was born in 2001. We decided to not have smartphones ourselves and not get Wi-Fi to the house. We decided it would be harder to moderate our use than to simply not have those devices and that kind of access from the home. He and I both had big computer setups at work. And so we really kept it very siloed and discreet, our online engagement. And I have to say that worked really well. When our kids were little, they didn't spend a lot of time on screens. They did develop, other skills and outlets. We did a lot of outdoor activities in nature and sports. We really emphasized, positive exercise and sleep and things like that, family time, not on screens. But by the time our eldest got into high school, she basically came home and said, I cannot function as a high school student without Wi-Fi to the house. And when we investigated that, we found that was true. Mm-hmm. So we got Wi-Fi to the house. And then she came home a couple of weeks later, having purchased her very own iPhone and her own iPhone plan, and said, I can't function socially as a teenager without my own phone. And really, Andrea, it's been downhill since then.
No, we just got a phone for my 7th grader who said the same thing. She said, I can't do these problems in class. They say, take out your phones. And she was the only one sitting there. So it got to a point where we had to cave. But we were on the same vein as you, trying to hold off as long as we could.
Right. And I think, that's what I do think that these problems to a certain extent can be addressed in the nuclear family. And my advice to parents is to severely limit screen time for your children as long as you can, which is about to age 12 or 13. And then essentially, it's over. Between the schools and their friends, they will see what they will see. But if you can have the dialogue about it, and what I mean by the dialogue is what I write about in Dopamine Nation. Explain the neuroscience to kids. Explain that this can be an addictive drug. Talk about what are some of the warning signs and how to limit the sort of escalating use toward addiction, and the importance simply of doing that. Right, even just having the conversation about the fact that it is a drug and that we must be mindful about the way that we're using these devices is a really good starting place. And then just continue to have these conversations, continue to reflect back to, our children, what we see about their use, which concerns us, what we hear from others about what they're putting online, which concerns us, because, invariably there will be mistakes made. And so, it's just a constant discussion at home.
Rule number 3, take responsibility.
Who's prescribing all of these pills? We'll read a lot about so-called pill mill doctors. These are doctors who are willfully exchanging prescriptions for cash. These are doctors who have lost their moral compass. Certainly, those kinds of doctors exist. They have always existed. But if you think that pill mill doctors are the primary driver of this epidemic, then you have misunderstood it. This epidemic is not the result of a small subset of prolific prescribers. We are all prescribing too many opioids. This is a study that we published in JAMA, where we looked at the Medicare database from 2013 to see who's prescribing opioids. And really the most important take-home message from our study was that, again, it's not a small subset of prolific prescribers driving this, that everybody in medicine is prescribing too many opioids, no matter what your medical specialty. If you look at it by volume, it's internal medicine and family medicine doctors, as well as nurse practitioners, because there are more of them. If you look at it by specialty, it's pain doctors, which makes sense. But really the bottom line is that everybody in medicine today prescribes too many opioids for minor and chronic pain conditions. This is from the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. The take-home message from this image is that great big yellow circle is the more than 11 million people in this country who misuse prescription opioids. Okay, so we're not talking about heroin, we're not talking about illicit fentanyl, we're talking about more than 11 million people in this country who are developing some kind of opioid use disorder or addiction. Now compare that to this much smaller circle, which is the approximately 1 million people who use heroin. Also a huge problem. But again, I just want to make sure that you leave today understanding that heroin is a huge problem in this country, illegal fentanyl is a huge problem, but prescription opioids are the origins of this epidemic and continue to be a very significant problem. Where are people getting the prescription opioids that they're misusing? Well, what you'll see here is that about 35% get them from a single prescriber. The large section here is those who get them from a friend or family member, many of whom got them from a single prescriber. What this gets at is that whether directly or indirectly, prescribers are the major conduit of misused prescription drugs in this country. This also importantly speaks to something that I've called the tsunami effect. Part of what has driven this opioid epidemic is not just people getting addicted through their doctor's prescriptions, but the huge increase in pills in medicine cabinets across the country that teenagers and other people also have access to.
Rule number 4, embrace friction.
I think that life for humans has always been hard, but I think that now it's harder in unprecedented ways. And I think that the way that life is really hard now is that it actually is really boring. And the reason that it's boring is because all of our survival needs are met, right? I mean, we don't even have to leave our homes to meet every single physical need, as long as you're of a certain level of financial well-being, which frankly, we talk so much about, the income gap. And certainly there is this enormous gap between rich and poor, but that gap is smaller than it's ever been in like the history of humans. Even the poorest of the poor have more excess income to spend on leisure goods than they ever have before in human history. If you look at leisure time, for example, so people without a high school education have 42% more leisure time than people with a college degree. So my point here is that life is hard now in this really weird way, in that we don't really have anything that we have to do. So we're all forced to make stuff up, whether it's being a scientist or being a doctor or being an Olympic athlete or, climbing Mount Everest. And people really vary in their need for friction. And some people need a lot more than others. And if they don't have it, they're really, really unhappy. And I do think that a lot of the people that I see with addiction and other forms of mental illness are people who need more friction. Like they're unhappy, not necessarily because there's something wrong with their brain, but because their brain is not suited to this world.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5, watch your lifestyle.
Last week I had Herman Ponsor on who lived with the Hudzas, and they're not struggling with addiction. They're living in their natural environment.
Yes. I mean, one of the main points I make in Dopamine Nation is that we are living in a time of unprecedented access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, and that the smartphone is essentially the equivalent of the hypodermic needle delivering digital dopamine 24/7. And our primitive brains have really not evolved for this environment. So it's really the mismatch between our brains and the world that we've created, which has led to a lot of suffering. If you look at the top reasons for death and disease across the globe, it's related to our sedentary lifestyle, our diet, and to addiction.
Rule number 6, minimize anxiety.
When people come to see you and they're anxious and they're saying, I need some help, do they know it's because they've played too many video games? Or do they know that? Do we know what dopamine surplus is?
Yeah, great question. So they almost always don't recognize that as a potential cause. The way they experience it is that their cannabis or alcohol or video games are self-medicating the depression and the anxiety and the insomnia and the boredom and whatever it is. What they don't realize is that by continually engaging in those high reward behaviors, they're essentially driving or creating the states of anxiety, depression, and insomnia. That is very hard to see, right? All they know is that they feel bad in general, and using their drug gives them some temporary relief, which of course it does because their balance is tilted to the side of pain and it restores homeostasis. Now, originally their drug might have done this for them and made them happy. But again, with repeated use, all it does is bring them back here, but it's all relative, right? The brain is working through this, it's a different theory of relativity to kind of restore homeostasis, which is why this period of abstinence is so important, because it allows people to really see true cause and effect. Like when we're in the cycle, we don't see it. But when we get some distance from it, we can look back and say, oh, wow, I feel so much better now that I've abstained for a month. And I look back and it's kind of crazy how I was using drug X, Y, or Z. Like it's sort of a shock to me, you know? And so it's abstaining that really gives that flash of insight.
Rule number 7, avoid the risk.
There is still huge geographic variability in opioid prescribing in this country, and we're going to get into a little bit what may be driving that. But just take a look at some of these data. In 2012, in the United States, doctors were writing on average 81 opioid prescriptions per 100 persons in this country. In 2017, which is the last year for which we have reliable data, that went down. That's the good news, to 59 opioid prescriptions per 100 persons. But look at the state of Alabama in 2017, 107 opioid prescriptions per 100 persons, a decrease from the 121 opioid prescriptions that were being written in Alabama in 2012, but still you can see we've got a long way to go. Some counties have rates that are 7 times the national average. This is a heat map. The darker red is more opioid prescribing. The lighter is less opioid prescribing. This is when we peaked at 2012. Watch what happens over time. Keep your eye on Alabama and the southeastern United States. 2017, we've made a lot of progress, but we're still not where we need to be. Also, look at this same heat map when you divide it by county. You'll note that even in states where opioid prescribing is relatively low, there are counties where there's a lot of opioid prescribing going on. And if you compare how we're prescribing today compared to the rest of the world, we're still prescribing 3 to 4 times as many opioids as most other developed countries, more than 10 times as many opioids as Japan. And here's an interesting thing. Germany and Canada just switched places. Canada was in second place. Now Germany has moved up. One thing we know that's happening is that Mundi Pharma, an outreach of Purdue Pharma, has now taken its marketing campaign to countries abroad. Also, at the same time that opioid prescribing has been going down, it appears as if benzodiazepine prescribing, Valium, Xanax, Ativan, Klonopin, is going up in this country, along with associated deaths. When opioids and benzos are co-prescribed, the risk of accidental overdose goes up. How do people die from opioids? Well, basically, they fall asleep, they stop breathing, and they don't wake up again. Because opioids slow down the heart rate, they slow down the respiratory drive. When you add Xanax or Valium to an opioid, that increases the risk of that kind of sedation and accidental overdose.
Rule number 8, find balance.
Let's talk about the pleasure-pain balance and addiction. And I've heard you use this seesaw or balance scale analogy before. And I think it's a wonderful one that really, for me, clarified what addiction is, at least at the mechanistic level.
Yeah. So to me, one of the most significant findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located, which means the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like a balance. So when we feel pleasure, our balance tips one way. When we feel pain, it tips in the opposite direction. And one of the overriding rules governing this balance is that it wants to stay level. So it doesn't want to remain tipped very long to pleasure or to pain. And with any deviation from neutrality, the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what scientists call homeostasis. And the way the brain does that is with any stimulus to one side, there will be a tip in equal and opposite amount to the other side.
It's like the principal laws of physics.
Yes, right, yeah. Right. So like I like to watch YouTube videos. When I watch YouTube videos of American Idol, it tips to the side of pleasure. And then when I stop watching it, I have a come down, right, which is a tip to the equal and opposite amount on the other side. And that's that moment of wanting to watch one more YouTube video, right?
Well, yeah. And I just want to interject there. So this moment of wanting to watch another that is associated with pain, I think, is are we always aware of that happening? Because you just described it in a very conscious way.
Right.
But when I indulge in something I enjoy, I'm usually thinking about just wanting more of that thing. I don't think about the pain. I just think about more.
Right. So really excellent point, because we're mostly not aware of it. And it's also reflexive. So it's not something that consciously happens or that we're aware of unless we really begin to pay attention. And when we begin to pay attention, we really can become very aware of it in the moment. Again, it's like a falling away, like that, you're on social media and, you get a good tweet of something, and then you can't stop yourself because there's this awareness, a latent awareness that as soon as I disengage from this behavior, I'm going to experience a kind of a pain, right? A falling away, a missing that feeling, a wanting more of it. And of course, one way to combat that is to do it more, right? And more and more and more. So I think that is really what I want people to tune into and get an awareness around, because once you tune into it, you can see it a lot. And then when you begin to see it, you have, and if you keep the model of the balance in mind, I think it gives people kind of a way to imagine what they're experiencing on a neurobiological level and understand it. And in that understanding, get some mastery over it, which is really what this is all about. Because ultimately, we do need to disengage, right? We can't live in that space all the time, right? We have other things we need to do. And there are also serious consequences that come with trying to repeat and continue that experience or that feeling.
Rule number 9, reduce vulnerability.
Is there a way for a person to know if something is going to be addictive for them other than if they had maybe relatives that were addictive? Because I think about it like I've never been very experimental. It's like I've never had desire to try cocaine or, and so what makes, is this a novelty seeking gene in different people? Because to me, I don't even like to take prescription medicine because I'm so afraid, but what makes some people more eager to engage in certain things that have risk?
Well, I mean, there are people are born with different temperaments, and some people are just naturally drawn to risk and to adrenaline. Adrenaline itself can be addictive. A huge surge of adrenaline all at once releases a lot of dopamine in the reward pathway, which is why people can get addicted to things like skydiving. And that actually happens. Also, we know that as a baseline temperament, if you're more impulsive, you're more likely to get addicted. And impulsivity basically just means that there's kind of no pause between having a thought to do something or saying something and just doing it or saying it. It's kind of like there's no gap there. So impulsivity is correlated. People who have cognitive struggles are correlated with having higher risk of addiction. So things like attention deficit disorder, people who have problems with executive functioning, future planning, those are things that confer risk. Really, any co-occurring mental illness makes a person, more vulnerable to the problem of addiction. So there are lots of sort of correlates that we can look at. But I think one of the important points too, beyond the correlates of our own brain and our own temperament, is simple access. So having more access to addictive substances makes us more vulnerable to that problem. And again, we're living in a time now of almost infinite access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is study opioids.
Prior to 1980, doctors were reluctant to prescribe opioids because they were afraid that their patients would get addicted to them. And for good reason. This country had seen 2 prior opioid epidemics, one that started with soldiers using morphine during the Civil War that culminated in the narcomania of the early 1900s when heroin was sold next to Bayer aspirin as a cough and cold remedy for babies. By the way, heroin is just morphine with 2 acetyl groups added. It was supposed to be the non-addictive alternative to morphine. Remember that theme, it will recur.
Then in the Vietnam era, we saw another major opioid epidemic in this country when our vets were coming home addicted to opium. One very interesting thing about that also is a resonating theme, is that when they came back, more than 2/3 of them had a resolution of their opioid addiction simply by being back in the United States where they had decreased access. And then we have our current opioid epidemic, which in terms of scale and impact, in terms of mortality, is unrivaled in terms of any other drug epidemic in this country. Basically, what happened in the 1980s in medicine is that doctors recognized we were not doing enough to help patients with pain. The 1980s was also the advent of the hospice movement imported from Europe, when there was recognition that people were dying in extremis. There was the idea that, hey, let's use opioids more liberally to help people in extreme pain and to help people at the very end of life. In other words, what started out as a very well-intentioned movement inside medicine ultimately gave way to doctors dispensing opioids like vending machines to pretty much anybody who walked in the office and said, I have pain. In other words, there was a Kuhnian paradigm shift inside of medicine where opioids became first-line treatment for minor pain conditions and also chronic pain conditions. They basically became the default to treat pain, period. And it's no coincidence that this epidemic is in sync exactly with an increase in opioid prescribing. So opioid prescribing in this country quadrupled between the 1990s and about 2010. It peaked in 2012. And along with that, we saw a quadrupling in opioid overdose mortality in this country. One of the reasons that I talk so much about moderation in the book is because there are many drugs today that we simply cannot just eliminate from our lives. Smartphones is one of them. Most of us need them to function in our jobs. So how do we use them in a healthy and adaptive way? Food is another example. Obviously, we can't eliminate food. So how do we engage with food in a way that is not addictive, but that, of course, allows us to eat in a healthy way? Sex is another one for people with sex addiction. You know, I think a part of a healthy life for many people is to have some sexual activity. But how do we then differentiate, addictive sexual activity from healthy sexual activity? So this question of how to moderate has really become very essential for modern life.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag Believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video because you are awesome. If you want 10 more amazing rules from Jordan Peterson, check out the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
A lot of people don't read because they're afraid of books. The books aren't their friend. So you might want to get a few books and kind of make them your friend. You can start with simpler books.